TCL is a proud sponsor of the SKOR North Studios. TCL, America's fastest growing TV brand. It's Minnesota Sports Rewind.
Long from 16, and Kevin Garnett with a rebound. It was a good shot. It just didn't fall for the Bulls. A 20-4 run now, the last 9 minutes. Marbury kicks into the corner. Gugliotta lays it in.
Beautifully done. Gugliotta with 6 points here. And they are running.
Minnesota Timberwolves are going to end the 0-4 against the Chicago Bulls.
And it's New Year's Day early.
These fans react as the streamers come down. They are going absolutely berserk. The NBA Finals, well, no, not quite. But the fact that they've never beaten the Bulls makes this like they've just won the NBA Finals or a trip to the playoffs.
I got goosebumps. I just got goosebumps listening to that right there. That was amazing.
How much fun was it to go back and watch that game and realize how much, just because the franchise has been so bad for so long now, how much we had forgotten about that team? There
is so much to get into. Let's set the scene. This is Minnesota Sports Rewind, a brand new show on SKOR North as of about a year ago. We did just a handful of episodes in podcast form, and we're bringing this back as a live Tuesday and Thursday show here at 11 o'clock on SKOR North. And you can binge all of the episodes we have posted right now. Just search Minnesota Sports Rewind, Apple, Spotify, anywhere you find podcasts, the SKOR North app. I'm Phil Mackey. That's Judd Zulgad. We got Declan Goff over here. And Tom Hanneman will join us later on here in about 25 minutes, which should tip you off to what we're about to dive into. And that is the trademark win at the time of the Kevin Garnett era, the rise of the KG and Stephon Marbury Timberwolves. December 30th, 1997, a 99-95 win over Michael Jordan's Chicago Bulls. And you can find the full game by just searching Bulls Timberwolves. I think 1997. It's 2.5 hours on YouTube, maybe even 2 hours out the commercial breaks. So go check it out. But just to set the scene, Judd Zulgad, the Timberwolves are coming off their first ever playoff appearance the year before.
Right.
They finished, I believe, 40-42 the year before. So they still had not finished above 500 as a franchise, but they did make the playoffs, and they were in the mix as a fast-rising young team. They actually got out to a slow start in the 1997-98 season, and that game against Chicago was part of a 4-game winning streak that put them over 500, and then they excelled the rest of the way and won 45 games. And it was essentially their ignition into becoming an above 500 playoff staple for the next 6 or 7 years or so. Mm-hmm. So some notables about this game. The Wolves were 0-16 against the Bulls in their history heading into this season. This is not to be mistaken with the other home game the Wolves played against the Bulls a couple months later where Dennis Rodman kicked a photographer. That was a different game.
Yes.
That was, I believe, early 1998. And that was the same night, I believe, that Governor Arnie Carlson closed down schools because of a blizzard or it was too cold or something.
Okay.
That's a different, for people wondering, that's a different game. This is the first win over the Michael Jordan Chicago Bulls. Michael Jordan in this game actually surpassed Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's record of 787 games played with at least 10 points scored. Kevin Garnett, Stephon Marbury, and Tom Gugliotta all had at least 20 points for the Timberwolves. Jordan had 33, and the Wolves overcame a double-digit third-quarter deficit to win 99-95. Confetti streamed down from the rafters as if they had just won the championship, and basically at that point in Timberwolves history, they did. Like, that was their championship. Huge. So the Bulls had 2 decent built-in excuses for this game, which we can talk about too. Number 1, Scottie Pippen was injured and did not play. And number 2, Michael Jordan was delivered a message at halftime saying that there was a phone call that had his mother being rushed to the hospital. Mm-hmm. And he didn't even make it out for the first, just for like the shoot-around portion in the first part of the second half. Mm-hmm. And you could kind of see on his face, he was a little bit distant in the second half.
Yeah, he comes back on the bench, on the Bulls bench, Phil, with 8:46 left in the third quarter.
Right.
So he was not back till then on the bench, much less on the court.
So the call ended up being a hoax, and we'll dive into it. But a distracted Michael Jordan missed a key free throw late in the game. But hey, the Wolves don't have to apologize. They beat the Bulls.
The Wolves made that very clear post game that night too.
Right. So let's start out with key question number one of many here. How far do you think the Timberwolves would have gone if 1 year later Stephon Marbury didn't demand a trade? Because it's amazing to watch this game and all the celebration and the vibe inside Target Center.
Yep.
And you thought, man, like Stephon Marbury and KG this is the next big pairing in the NBA.
And Flip is so young, and Mikhail. Did you see Mikhail in the sweater?
It was he was still rocking the same sweater game like 10 years later.
But
at the time it was. Yeah.
But Mikhail looks at that game like he's 25 years old. He looks like a kid.
He just retired a couple years earlier,
looks like
right?
a pup. Yeah, he's a young man at that point.
So if Marbury had not demanded out.
Yes.
A year later. And it's amazing to think that, like, with everything they had going on, and they went to a fifth game with the Seattle Sonics in a 5-game series in the playoffs that year, like, why would he demand out, and why would egos get in the way of this thing? But if they had kept that thing together and they kept the chemistry, how far, like, what do you think that nucleus could have done?
Boy. So that was, that team, and if you go back and watch that game, it's pretty crystal clear, too. It's a young team that's mixed with veteran players who come off the bench and contribute. And I think that team was starting to get to the point that Flip and Mikhail desired as far as personnel construction, too. I think if Steph hadn't got jealous of Garnett's stature in this town, he hadn't got, and he definitely did, jealous of the fact that Garnett got paid that huge contract, which of course then brought in different rules about the salary cap and contracts and max contracts, that this team could have been a finals team with that group. Because think of that core group. And if you had altered that, and let's say Terry Porter leaves, Mitchell leaves, but if your core group, and I'll throw a third name in for a guy who I guess got disgruntled or things went sideways for here. But let's say Garnett, Marbury, and Googs. Let's just start there. Those three. Let's say that they all get along. Let's say that they say, you know what? Garnett is the star, but damn it, we're really good. So I'll take your question and one up it a little bit because Googs, if I'm not mistaken, was the first to go.
Yep.
So if I take your question and say Marbury stays, and Marbury in that era of point guards to me was a dynamic player. There are times.
Yeah, look what he did in this game.
And guess what? He did not have a great shooting night at all.
Yeah,
he dominated. But there were times he dominated that game. And so if you leave Garnett, Marbury, and Googs together, and they play that thing out, I don't know if the Wolves win a title for sure, but I think they get to a finals.
Yeah,
or more.
So we had a similar discussion on Mackey and Judd with Rami this week about if the Wolves had, knowing how things played out with Stephon Marbury, if they had just kept Ray Allen in the 1996 draft. And I stand by what I said on the show after sleeping on it. I think in that early 2000s period, after the Lakers had kind of dissolved their dynasty, but before LeBron James took over the league and Michael Jordan's out, yeah, you had the Spurs, but you had this weak soft spot in the NBA from like 2004 through 2008. And Gugliotta was 28 years old in the 1997 season. So if you fast forward 5 or 6 years later, Googs would have been out of the equation by that point, by like 2004, 05, 06.
Right, but let's say 2000.
But let's just take the Marbury KG. Well, 2000, I think the Wolves still would run up against the Lakers, but maybe they're playing in the Western Conference Finals or something.
Right.
But if you go a few years beyond that, when most superstars get to the point, Michael Jordan, LeBron James, most superstars have to play 6 or 7 years, be 27, 28 years old, and then they hit their championship peak and prime.
Mm-hmm.
And if KG and Marbury were both buying into the same vision and were both working together to build a culture and to build something, and Marbury doesn't bleep and bail, those guys are emerging into their basketball prime at 28 years old in the soft spot of the NBA's history. And literally the New Jersey Nets were coming out of the Eastern Conference.
Oh, and those finals were awful.
Like young LeBron James is coming out of the Eastern Conference. It was
Spurs and Nets for 2 years there, and it was just brutal.
And a weak Mavericks team, weak by championship standards, a weak Mavericks team took on a young Dwayne Wade at one point. Like I think they would have been in the championship mix had they stuck together with it for 7 or 8 years.
So going back and watching that game, here's something that I had completely forgotten too. And to me, it's a key to that win, and it's a key to where Flip had that team going. Did you notice in that game that Steph is pretty much the heartbeat of the team? Garnett makes some big plays, and Garnett's really good. But he's not the over-the-top, dynamic, consistent player as far as being the heartbeat of that team that Steph was on that night.
As MJ comes through, puts it up. Garnett with a rebound, gets it out to Marbury. He pushes it up the floor. Marbury comes down, puts it up, and got it, and he's fouled by Ron Harper. Longley spins with a rolling hook just off, and Kevin Garnett with another rebound.
Going to post Dennis up. Let's see a long distance three. Yeah, it's there.
Stephon Marbury for the three.
That's to take Tony here. Too easy that time, and they tie the score up.
Marbury again.
He was.
Yeah.
He's the guy, though. He makes plays, pounds his chest. I felt that in watching that game for the first time in what now, 23 years or so, that night in that game, which at the time, franchise history-wise, was a big deal, Steph Marbury was the heartbeat of that team. And Garnett plays a key role. I'm not trying to put him down, but I completely forgotten that Flip, and Flip had to be so pleased because Flip was a point guard. And how much did Flip demand, right? He was always all over his point guard, and his point guard was, in his mind, if not his most important player, certainly up there. And Steph Marbury that night, and he shot 8 of 18, so he did not have a great night from the floor, but he hit some big shots, and at so many different junctures of that game where it could have gotten away from the Wolves, it's Steph Marbury who makes those key plays and sort of grounds that team.
Yeah, and I get so nostalgic watching that game back because I was 12 years old during that game.
It was fun.
And was becoming this huge Timberwolves fan, and that was the era of Minnesota sports where you had KG and Marbury rising up. The very next year, the Vikings draft Randy Moss, and it took a few more years for the Twins to get into the mix. But it was, at that time the Twins were dormant, and there was no professional hockey in this town, and the Vikings were coming off a run before they drafted Randy Moss where they made the playoffs on a regular basis, but they didn't really have a franchise quarterback, and so Stephon Marbury and Kevin Garnett were the heartbeat of the sports city at that time.
That's a fantastic point based on this. Before Moss came here, the Vikings had largely grown stale. Still popular, but if you go back, I believe it was the penultimate game against the Colts, home game in 97 is the last game that the Vikings had blacked out. And that's a playoff team. Mm-hmm. And that was largely, I always felt the crowd that followed them from Met Stadium, the old guard, they liked the Vikings, but it took Moss, his arrival in 98 here to really change the dynamic to make the Vikings hip and cool. But go back and play just a brief snippet of the Marbury clip that you just played and listen behind him, listen to that crowd and think to yourself, when's the last time that you heard a Target Center crowd like this?
Especially on a regular basis.
As MJ comes through, puts it up. Garnett with a rebound, gets it out to Marbury. He pushes it up the floor. Marbury comes down, puts it up, and got it, and he's fouled by Ron Harper. 92-89, Timberwolves with the lead, and now this crowd is starting to believe that they'll win.
Now the Bulls don't want any fouls here. They just like to play some real good defense.
Marbury drives baseline, bounces it to Hanneman. To Kevin Garnett on top from 20. Garnett.
Yes, sir. Beautifully done. Garnett with a 15-footer. That's all you want.
That was a great shot, by the way.
It was a little pull-up elbow 15-footer.
Really nice shot.
It's hard to imagine the vibe and everything you felt watching that game and the reaction after they win the game and the streamers are coming down and Stephon Marbury is doing snow angels at center court.
I think he kissed the floor.
Yeah.
He threw the ball up about 15 rows too in the first row.
Yeah, right after the buzzer sounds.
Yeah.
And KG is thumping his chest and literally 1 year later, it just got flushed.
Yeah.
And then they went on because KG was so good. They went on to still go to the playoffs 6 times. It's just such a classic Minnesota sports thing for you have that bottled up. You beat Michael Jordan's Bulls. You're on the rise with the best young tandem in the NBA. And then 1 year later, for absolutely no reason other than ego, and we will get to the Stephon Marbury portion of this, it's just gone. In fact, let's get to the Stephon Marbury portion right now, since we're cutting open this vein. Key question number 2 here on Minnesota Sports Rewind. How much did Stephon Marbury screw up by forcing his way out?
Massively, immensely, both personal and Wolves-wise. He made a huge mistake because I think what put him over the edge was probably the KG contract. And he thought to himself, well, Glen just paid KG this. I'm not going to get that. But if you go back and track this man's career, Phil, he goes what? He wanted to go to the Knicks. He went to the Nets. Terrell Brandon, who was a good player, comes here, but then he's hurt quite a bit. He screwed up because, in my mind, Stephon Marbury, as a young player here with KG, also had the ideal coach. The coach loved him. Flip loved him. Flip would have used him to Steph's last day, even as the game changed. Flip would have used him to the best of Steph's ability. He had the ideal coach. And to force his way out, it was a huge mistake and a gamble that was so selfish and, in retrospect, counterproductive to everybody involved. It's one of the biggest mistakes made, I think, by an athlete who has played in this town.
So he wanted to get, in part, he wanted to run the show as the star, right? So he wanted to be the centerpiece. So ego was in play. He also wanted to live out east and live in New York, New Jersey, and that was part of it. Although I don't think I think the broken ego part played more of a role than I just kind of want to go live back out east. Yeah. So he spent 2.5 years with the New Jersey Nets after that trade. The year that he got traded, they went 16-34. The next year they went 31-55. And the year after that they went 26-56. Stephon Marbury played 11 years in the NBA after that trade to New Jersey, and he bounced around to 3 or 4 different teams, right? In those 11 years, he finished above 500 twice. Twice. Yeah. That was it. Once with the Phoenix Suns, and then I believe the year after it was the 2002-2003 season with the Phoenix Suns, and they just didn't like his style of play and had a chance to get Steve Nash, so they traded Stephon Marbury. They got Steve Nash.
That might have been a good trade, by the way.
And they got even better 2 years ago, or 2 years later, when they won 60 games. The only other year, so that's really the only year that he finished above 500 outside of the Timberwolves, because I don't even count the second one, was him as the third point guard on the 2008-2009 Boston Celtics, where he was just Rajon Rondo was their point guard, and they just brought Stephon Marbury back because, what the hell, let's rekindle the KG thing. He didn't even, he played no factor on that team, and was not at all the reason why they finished above 500. So if you take that season out, he played 10 more years in the NBA after that trade and finished above 500 one time.
For what? For what?
For ego.
Yeah.
He's a bigger star in China,
yes,
than he is in the United States. And I think the biggest question would be, all right, well, his career turned out to be, over those 10 years after he left the Timberwolves, a lot of great individual numbers. He was very much a 20 points per game guy who would get the 8 or 9 assists, and he made some All-Star games. In fact, actually he only made 2 All-Star games, but he was a 20 point, 9 assist guy, and he put up numbers. Kind of a volume scorer who would shoot 40%. I think he would have been a better version of himself under Flip Saunders, with Kevin Garnett, with everything they had being built there. So, on one hand, you can project out and say, well, Marbury never really lived up to how good he was supposed to be because he just wasn't a winning player. But I think he was a winning player under Flip Saunders and with Kevin Garnett.
I agree completely. Yes. And the other thing about that time, and kids, I'm not lying here, it's true. The other thing about that team, that roster, that coach, that GM, Kevin McHale built a really good team. And Glen Taylor owned that team. For all we can take, last 15 years? 13 years? And say, what a train wreck. What a disaster. When Taylor bought that team, and McHale had the intestinal fortitude to draft KG, which took guts. That's a high school player, first time in 20 years.
Yeah.
And then I know in your mind it didn't work out perfectly, but then you work the draft night trade and get Steph from the Bucks. The Wolves made some really, really good moves. And that roster, that game, that's a nice roster, a really good complementary mix of young players coming of age and veterans who Flip used basically perfectly.
Yeah, you had Kevin Garnett and Stephon Marbury were 20 and 21 years old at that time, 1997, 1998. Tom Gugliotta was maybe even the best player on the team. You could make a case for that, and I have a key question off that in a second, too.
Okay.
But he was 28, so you had this workman-like star in Tom Gugliotta, and that was your three-headed monster. And the veterans you put around, so Anthony Peeler was a sniper shooter from the Los Angeles Lakers earlier on that decade, and you bring him in as a guy who can just sit out there. He shot 45% from three-point range that season, which is something you didn't see very often in 1997. Terry Porter, people forget, like Terry Porter on those Blazers teams that went to the NBA Finals and played against Michael Jordan. Terry Porter was scoring 18 points a game for an a Western Conference championship team, right? Mm-hmm. And he's in there playing 20, 25 minutes a game. Doug West, the veteran from the early days.
I forgot he was still there at this
Timberwolves history.
This game. Yes.
And Sam Mitchell was playing 30 minutes a night as a 34-year-old. And then all kinds of other guys like Cherokee Parks, Tom Hammonds, these reliable rebounding big men, Stanley Roberts, Chris Carr, I think won a dunk contest at one point, and he's coming off the bench as just a wing athlete type. So, those rosters were, we think back on the Kevin McHale era and think, oh my God, what a train wreck. You know, how could you not put a secondary star on Garnett for all those years? And how could you blow 4 first-round picks with signing Joe Smith under the table? And those things are all very much a part of his resume as well. But he found KG, he found Stephon Marbury as a great compliment, and they built out this great set of complementary players, and they had it. They had it.
That's what I'm saying.
And Stephon Marbury.
I think that was going to be a finals team. I really do. Because for that era of basketball, for what that GM and coach were trying to do, it all gelled. It really did.
I'm getting sad. Just
Steph broke the group up.
I can't finish the episode.
Steph quit the group.
I need a moment.
The only question that I would, God bless him, love to go back and ask Flip about that game was, you really started Chris Carr on MJ that night? Because he did.
That's right.
There was
who were you? At one point, KG was guarding MJ too.
They flipped KG to him, and KG was not as fast, but at least young, and
praying mantis,
and he could move. Poor Chris Carr. Chris Carr's like, what do you want me to do? This is Michael Jordan.
MJ top of the circle with Garnett on him. 6 on the shot clock. Michael goes by him off the glass, puts it in.
By the way, heck of a broadcast on the Bulls side there. We had that. The only thing that's on YouTube for the full game is the Johnny Red Kerr Chicago Sports Channel. It was literally called Sports Channel in Chicago.
With 1997 commercials baked in, too, which was just as great.
Aren't they great?
Yeah, Discover Card and plenty of other things. Choice Bank, I think, was in there.
It's pretty amazing.
Mullets in play.
Yeah.
Okay, here's another key question for you. Mm-hmm. And we're going to get to Tom Hanneman, who was the sideline reporter at the time, interviewed Kevin Garnett right after this game was over. Is Tom Gugliotta the most underrated player in Timberwolves history?
Ooh, wish I had time to think about that.
Have you guys ever gone back and look? Like, I remember as a kid, I just remember Googly baby. He made an all-star game.
He might have been obtained in one of the 3 best trades the Wolves have ever made, though. I'll tell you that.
Right?
No, he went from the Bullets to the Warriors.
Okay.
The Wolves drafted Donyell Marshall out of UConn. But McHale, to his credit, realized Donyell Marshall might have not liked basketball as much as he thought. So instead of just swallowing hard and being like, yeah, he'll be fine, he flips him really quickly to the Warriors for Googs. And I was at the game, and he didn't play, but Googs was obtained, I want to say, on like a Friday or Saturday. And Dawn and I were in the upper deck. The Wolves were playing Shaquille O'Neal and the Magic at home, and they brought Googs in and said, please welcome the newest Timberwolves, Tom, and he came out and waved. And he was pretty well known. He is among probably the most unheralded but really good players.
Dude, his numbers?
He's a hell of a player.
So I'm just going to give you his numbers from that 1997-98 season, which he was an all-star the year before. I think.
So he's 28 at this point?
He's 28. Okay. He's in his prime. He's playing 39 minutes a night. So 1997-98, Tom Gugliotta averaged 20 points, 9 rebounds, and 4 assists, a steal and a half, and shot 50% from the field.
Yeah.
And 82% from the free throw line. That's absurd. The year before, he was 21 points a game, 9 rebounds, 4 assists, and a steal and a half.
He's a really
made the All-Star game.
Yeah, that was a great trade. It was a really great trade by McHale.
I think part of the story was him and Stephon Marbury did not see eye to eye.
I've heard differing things, yeah.
And the irony is Stephon Marbury, so Googs gets traded to Phoenix and spends basically the rest of he spent the next 5 years in Phoenix, and 2 years later he was not the same player. I think he had some injuries and stuff.
Yep.
But the funny thing is Stephon Marbury got traded to Phoenix as well after his 3 years in New Jersey. So they wound up teammates for like 2 years in Phoenix at the end of things. But think about that, KG and Marbury, and then Gugliotta's like, oh, that's right, Gugliotta was on those teams. Yeah, oh, that's right. He averaged 29
he was a key
4
part.
and shot 50%.
He was absolutely key.
It's ridiculous.
Absolutely. May I say this? In watching that game back, I had forgotten a little bit, at least, about the love of the long two.
Oh, man. Both teams.
Have you ever seen more long twos? And I'm talking about really good players who now would never do this.
Yes.
They all pull up and just shoot the long two.
I mean, think about the plays being drawn up in the triangle, too. And like one of the plays that they hit on, the Bulls did 5 different times, was Luke Longley, 12 feet, baseline, just wide open, or someone in his face, and it was just a shot that was part of their system.
Or guys who could have gotten or got the ball, could have taken a step back and shot a 3, would just shoot the 2.
And KG was, I was going to say was as guilty, but it wasn't guilt. Like that was how you played in KG's era. KG took so many shots from like 2 feet inside the 3-point line, and he was good at hitting those shots.
Yes.
So,
but still,
it was efficient for him.
It's hilarious to watch now.
All right, let's do this. We have a couple things to dive into here on the other side of this Minnesota Sports Rewind. We're going to get Kevin Garnett stories and a look inside the game that we're rewinding to. The 1997 December 30th win. Michael Jordan's Bulls slayed by the Timberwolves for the first time. The first real trademark win in Timberwolves franchise history. And Tom Hanneman will tell us some stories. Plus, was the victory tainted a little bit because of the hoax that was pulled on Michael Jordan at halftime of this thing? It's Minnesota Sports Rewind here on SKOR North. You can podcast all episodes of Minnesota Sports Rewind, including a deep dive into the greatest Twins team that never was last week, and all kinds of great Vikings episodes that we have posted as well, including deep dives into the 2009 Favre arrival. Minnesota Sports Rewind, anywhere you find podcasts, Apple, Spotify.
92-89, Timberwolves with the lead, and now this crowd is starting to believe that they'll win.
Now the Bulls don't want any fouls here. They just like to play some real good defense.
Marbury drives baseline, bounces it to Hanneman. To Kevin Garnett on top from 20. Garnett.
Yes, sir. Beautifully done. Garnett with a 15. That's all you
Man,
want.
that's courtesy of Sports Channel, 1997 Sports Channel in Chicago. We are a half hour into this episode of Minnesota Sports Rewind, focusing on the 1997 win by the Minnesota Timberwolves over Michael Jordan's Chicago Bulls. At the time, it was the trademark win of the Timberwolves' rise up during that era. And of course, a year later, Stephon Marbury's ego decided that he was good with it all. But Tom Hanneman, first of all, Phil Mackey here, Judd Zulgad. Before we dive in, we'd love some stories. We know that you were on the court and you were part of that broadcast team, but how are you? And it's great to hear you on the show here today.
Phil and Judd, I'm fine. Thanks for giving me a call. Most Wolves fans, and I'm in that grouping as well, have spent most of their life trying to forget about games rather than remember. But this was one that that stands out, and for all good reasons. It took 9 seasons for the franchise to have a winning record in that year, 97, 98, was the first time. And I know that there was some mocking going on at the time with the Bulls announced team afterwards, after the game, about, you guys look like you were celebrating a championship. And indeed, I think that fans felt that way. It was the closest thing that we had come, and to beat the mighty Michael Jordan, who went on to continue his string of championships with that Bulls team that year, was a pretty big deal. And about as exciting a moment until you got to the series win years later against Denver and then Sacramento. But it was an amazing night in so many ways. I know you've already delved into the Jordan component that night, and it made it interesting. But the fact was, very few people had any idea that any of that was going on at the time. So Being a sideline reporter, I did the halftime show that we did every game, and there's no Jordan.
Yeah.
And you're looking for Michael Jordan, of course, because you're following his every move. And so I run backstage and to the locker room area and don't see anyone. And after a couple minutes, here's Michael walking out of Sheldon Burns, the team physician's door. And he'd been on the phone with Tim Hallam, the Bulls' longtime PR director. And Tim said he's not talking, and we were able to find out, but not immediately what was going on. But yeah, Michael was 0 for 5, I think, in the third quarter of that game, and obviously it weighed heavily upon him because he didn't know whether it was true or not, and was able to find out later. But had kind of a rugged second half, and that played into it. But the game stood out for a lot of reasons, and most of them were very good.
So, Tom, the story was that Jordan or the Wolves got the call correct and passed on the information because clearly this is in the pre-cell phone days that Jordan's mom had been rushed to the hospital, and then I think they got subsequent calls. Did we ever get a lead in retrospect as to where the crank calls might have come from? Because that now is impossible. But going back and seeing the turmoil that the guy went through that night. That would be a lot to go through for anybody.
Yeah, it would. It would, yeah. Dolores Jordan, his mom, and the call came into the Target Center switchboard, as I understand, and a security guard, and I don't know why this happened, approached Jordan as the team was leaving the floor at halftime, and of course, he has no idea.
Right.
No one has any idea whether it's true or not, and his mind is immediately focused elsewhere. So, still, this is a guy that in his career averaged over 29 points a game against the Wolves. So to have an off night, he scored 33 points on an off night.
Yeah.
It tells you something about the guy.
What are one or two of your favorite interactions or stories about young Kevin Garnett in that first 3 or 4 years rising up before Stephon Marbury decided he wanted to leave and before things got a little tumultuous? What are a couple of your favorite anecdotes you can share with us?
Well, there's a lot of them. They're all in the book, which hasn't been written yet.
By the way, if that book gets written, we will plug the you-know-what out of it, so let us know.
The problem with writing books like that, kind of tell-alls, and most of them are very happy, is you end up bruising a lot of friendships and egos, so it's probably kept a few books from being written. But stories can be told, and, we loved KG from the moment that he arrived and, the first drills that he went through in St. Cloud at the time, where the team was starting their training camp and, tossing his cookies into a garbage can nearby. He was so excited and so amped and thinking, is this kid always like this? And, of course, we came to find out, yes. I got a chance because I was working sidelines and working as a reporter doing feature stories. We had to have a couple every game to get over to his apartment. His rookie year, he lived in a spot across from Ridgedale and had a couple dogs. And this is at a time that the apartment was filled with potato chips and a lot of junk food. A very young and raw Kevin Garnett, but I love the guy. I mean, it was hard not to love him. He was so open and so honest. And I feel badly in that the last few years of his time with the Timberwolves, before he came back, this was not quite the same guy. I think a lot of people felt, and I think some of the early years of Kevin Garnett were forgotten in the process, as a lot of us have looked back here with the Hall of Fame news this week. But Kevin was a character and was someone that was interested in interacting with people, and he did so many things that he asked me not to report on. and this was charitable stuff for the first 8 years or so that he was with the Wolves. So many of the great stories really are tough to kind of clean up a little bit, and that sounds awful, but he just was a remarkable player, and everyone will say the same thing about Kevin Garnett that spent any time with him. There was no off button at any time, whether it was practice, whether it was game, whether it was on the plane. This is back in a time early on, guys, when the media, even those of us working for the team, were asked to the back of the plane to play cards with players, and it was obviously they're out of our league economically, but it was a quarter a point type of thing. Those days changed dramatically in a very short time when stories of Reggie Miller and Charles Barkley dropping $30,000 a hand on some of the poker games that they played. But I've got a ton of stories about KG, and so many of them are off the court. But all I can tell you is really a remarkable guy, and I'm excited for what lies ahead for him this fall. It's pretty cool thing.
So, Tom, to go back to that night and that game, too, and I hadn't watched that game since that night, but it was so intriguing to watch it, to see how hip and cool the Wolves were, how the fans truly had bought in, and that's a building, that's a young nucleus of players with veterans at the time who were stability factors. But tell me this. In watching that, the one thing that stood out to me crystal clear was the heartbeat of that team that not KG was, but that Steph was. And as you watched that game from the sideline that night, what was your feeling on Steph? How do you feel that if Steph hadn't forced it his way out, things would have gone for the Wolves? And among the sad things in this team's history, and there's lots of those things, where does that forced divorce back in 1999 now rank?
Well, I can't tell you how excited we were working for the team at the time to have found a way to capture Steph Marbury in the trade for Ray Allen. And you look back on it now and you wonder, what if it hadn't been made? But that's another story. There's some unforgettable things with Steph Marbury. The morning that we learned, and we're driving over on the team bus for shoot around in Oakland, that Steph had forced his way into a trade. And we knew there'd been some conversation, but so Steph is on the bus and gets off, and he's good morning, good afternoon, and good night with a smile on his face to people. Sam Mitchell, when he heard about what had transpired, got so angry right in front of Steph, took the rack of basketballs and flung them at the Oracle, flung them into the second deck, kicked them over. I mean, he was in many ways a team leader, certainly at that time and for many seasons. He felt that Steph was disrespecting the team and the players, and people backed down to Sam Mitchell. When Sam Mitchell got into the altercation a year earlier in the playoffs against Houston, against Kevin Willis, I think it was game 2, and got a flagrant 2. Charles Barkley told me afterwards, because I figured, Charles would defend Kevin Willis. He said, "Oh, no, you don't mess with Sam Mitchell." He said, that's one guy that I would not mess with. And it was kind of a turning point in the franchise that they were thought of as not the pushover, even though Houston swept that series. But Sam was livid and let Steph know, and Steph kind of quietly went away. Now, many years later, I think it was 2007, I'm doing a Wolves game with Jim Pete, and I look back about 5 rows, and there's Steph Marbury. He had retired, wasn't playing for the NBA. His career was done before he went over to China. And during a commercial break, I got up and walked over, and I knew him fairly well and was excited to see him and said, "Hey, would you sit down with us for a while? Fans would love to hear from you." And to my surprise, he said yes. And we had, intermixed within that quarter, I thought one of the most interesting conversations with a guy, all the questions that you asked me about, where would the team be? What would have happened had he decided to stay and not let his ego and all the people around him who told him in New York that you're better and you deserve more and you shouldn't be there. He owned up and said it was a horrible mistake on my part. I think about it a lot.
Wow.
He was contrite. I was shocked. And as sad as the chapter was, I was kind of pleased that A, he had grown up, and B, that he understood what had occurred and what he missed out on. But I think he was all in and understanding how special that Timberwolves team would have been had he stayed, which, you remember him talking about what he missed in New York. I miss opening the window at night on a winter night and hearing cabs honking endlessly. And I thought, well, I don't know how many of us will miss opening the window at night in a winter situation in New York or Minneapolis, but I do think he missed it, but he messed up. And I think he realized it even back then.
Yeah. So Tom Hanneman, it's my belief that you bring up the Ray Allen thing. I think this holds true if Stephon Marbury stays, and I think this holds true if they just keep Ray Allen in the 1996 draft. Because Stephon Marbury, just to loop this around to my point, Stephon Marbury played 10 more years in the NBA after the Timberwolves traded him and finished above 500 once legitimately. I'm not counting his last year in Boston where he just kind of came in as like the third guard off the bench. I think if he would have stayed with the Timberwolves, I think he was a winning player under Flip. I think he was a winning player with Kevin Garnett, and ego and everything you just talked about got the best of him, and he regrets it. But there was a soft spot in the NBA in like 2004 through 2007 before LeBron James took over the league and after Michael Jordan was gone and after the Lakers dynasty had kind of dissolved. And yes, you still had the Spurs and you still had formidable teams, but if KG is emerging into his physical prime and Stephon Marbury had stayed the course, I honestly think we're talking about championships. Or if you had kept Ray Allen. I mean, I think just putting a legitimate sidekick around Kevin Garnett and building that thing and riding it for 7 or 8 years, I think we're talking a championship.
Yeah, NBA, I agree, Phil. NBA titles are all about windows, and I think that the Wolves were set up with either one of those players to have a window. Marbury was just 21 years old when he left the Wolves. And he goes on. He had 7 straight seasons where he averaged over 20 points a game, and got what he thought he wanted in terms of the adulation, and he was the man on those teams for the most part. But what he missed out on was something far more important, and sadly, in the process, Wolves fans missed out on that as well, and they're well aware of that. But fortunately, there were no other disappointments that would come in the future for the Timberwolves. So that helped that it was the only time.
By the way, there is one breaking right now that we'll get to it here in a second. There's some breaking KG news, but go ahead, Judd.
So, Tom, do you miss 2 things, the parquet floor and long twos? Because, baby, in watching that 97 game, I actually missed the parquet floor, but everybody and their brother shot long twos back then, and really, if you shot a 3, I think you got looked at a little bit sideways.
That season, I took a look at this this morning. That season, the Wolves, as a team, attempted 308 3-point shots. And Steph Curry, has attempted 889 in a single season in his career, and so obviously things have changed dramatically. Yeah, and the analytics didn't exist, but it's kind of commonsensical, isn't it, that that a long 2 is maybe the worst shot you can take, but things were evolving. I love that court. I did. I'm
really serious. Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, it was terrific, and Yeah, I'm amazed, guys, how loyal Timberwolves fans have remained through the ups and downs, and it's sadly primarily downs. This is a franchise that I love. I worked for the team for 23 years. Love to see them rise up, and we're all hoping it would happen. But people love it, and maybe it is that so many of us grew up with this franchise, and so they're in a sweet spot that way. I know that inaugural year when there's over 1 million fans, and the Metrodome wasn't exactly a conducive basketball arena, but people were just fired up and excited, and there were a lot of great memories. Sadly, it took, as mentioned, 9 years to get something like a win over Michael Jordan and the Bulls. But now you look at what the Wolves went on and did against Seattle after that win later in the spring, and I agree with the premise that this team, with Steph Marbury especially, Charles Barkley gathered Marbury and Garnett at the end of the first ever playoff series the Wolves were involved in. The Rockets swept them, but the last game, Minnesota showed, I think that the potential was really there, and Barkley grabs these two guys and said, hey, you two stay together. You're going to get some rings. And I don't think he was doing it just to be kind or nice. I think Charles Barkley really believed that.
Yeah. That's Tom Hanneman, everybody. Longtime Timberwolves announcer, reporter, broadcaster, everything, and storyteller. And we appreciate you coming on this episode of Minnesota Sports Rewind. And we will not put you on the spot with this, but when we hang up here, go to The Athletic and read the story about Kevin Garnett, the Q&A with Kevin Garnett that just came out, where he unveils some of his feelings about Glen Taylor and pour a stiff drink, even though it's only 11:51 in the morning right now. All right.
I can hardly wait.
All right.
More Wolves drama, Hanny.
Thanks so much.
Thanks,
All right,
Tom.
See you, Tom. That is Tom Hanneman, just one of the best dudes in the industry.
One of the nicest guys you'll ever will come across.
So it's not often we get breaking news during an episode of Minnesota Sports Rewind that fits the episode of Minnesota Sports Rewind.
We just got it.
But we're just going to read this. This is from an Athletic Q&A with Kevin Garnett, and there's a bunch of stuff they dive into. But the question was in regards to the Celtics retiring Kevin Garnett's jersey before the Timberwolves will retire his jersey. And Kevin Garnett says, quote, Glen Taylor knows where I'm at. I'm not entertaining it. First of all, it's not genuine. Number two, he's getting pressure from a lot of fans and I guess the community there. Glen and I had an understanding before Flip died, and when Flip died, that understanding went with Flip. For that, I won't forgive Glen. I won't forgive him for that. I thought he was a straight-up person, straight-up businessman, and when Flip died, everything went with him. There's no reason to complain. Just continue to move on. My years in Minnesota and in that community, I cherish. At this point, I don't want any dealings with Glen Taylor or Taylor Corporation or anything that has to do with him. I love my Timberwolves. I'll always love my guys. I'll always love the people who bleep with me there.
Yeah, that's...
be careful.
There's a few bleeps in there.
I'll always have a special place for the city of Minneapolis and the state of Minnesota in my heart. But I don't do business with snakes. I don't do business with snake MFers.
Mm-hmm, that's not nice.
I try not to do business with openly snakes or people who are snake-like.
It's a lot of snakes.
Not a snake guy myself, so I get what he's saying.
Indiana Jones wasn't a snake guy either.
A lot of snake comments
a lot of snakes.
right there.
Yeah.
So it's not going to take place for quite some time.
We'll do a deep dive into that on Mackey and Judd with Rami today. I want to wrap this episode here by asking you this question. When you go back and look at Kevin Garnett and Stephon Marbury and the game that we are diving into, which is the first real trademark breakthrough win in Timberwolves history, the win over Michael Jordan's Chicago Bulls at Target Center in 1997. One of the things I thought of when I watched that game play out and the energy and just the bond between Marbury and Garnett and Flip and the fans, like everything was just this symbiotic relationship that had the Wolves on a trajectory to potentially take over the Western Conference. Mm-hmm. And yes, they popped up a few years later and they went to the Western Conference Finals and Sam Cassell to Latrell Sprewell. But really, like, we've spent most of the last 20 to 25 years trying to recapture what we felt in the late 90s, right? With a couple little pop-ups here and there. Do you think Karl Anthony Towns and D'Angelo Russell realize or even want the responsibility that they have when it comes to Wolves fans and putting the organization back on that level?
Oh, boy, I sure don't have that.
'Cause on paper, that's the responsibility that they have been given.
It's a different era, different time. People are different now. I don't know that I can say I've seen that. And keep in mind, too, as Tom said, and this is the most important thing, and this can be bad at times, but it also can be good, Phil. KG was wired differently. Cat's not wired like that. KG was going to, in his mind, win, and he was going to do exactly what that took. And Flip then went and got him that complimentary piece, and in 1996, that was a point guard who was fantastic. Do I think that you can do it with a point guard and center that you currently have? I have no clue. I just, really, it was so much fun to go back and watch that game, though, to realize where this team was at one time. And unless you fully comprehend it, I honestly think right now, it's damn near impossible to understand that. Like, if I just tell you that, so if you just tuned in and you're like, this is fun, man. So the Wolves were like, I can tell you that and articulate it to you, but understanding that is tough.
92-89, Timberwolves with the lead, and now this crowd is starting to believe that they'll win.
Now, the Bulls don't want any fouls here. They just like to play some real good defense.
Marbury drives baseline, bounces it to Hanneman. To Kevin Garnett on top from 20. Garnett.
Yes, sir. Beautifully done. Garnett with a 15-footer.
Declan, what you were growing up? I'm assuming you kind of grew up in the KG era.
So,
too,
true
right?
story. This is actually the first sporting game I ever attended.
Really, dude?
I was 5 years old.
That's amazing.
And I briefly remember the significance of it just because my dad remembered telling me that it was the first time we're actually going to beat Michael Jordan. So
he called it before the game.
He called it. I remember driving in the 91 Volvo that we had to the game. And yeah, it was one of my earliest memories. My uncle had season tickets. So yeah, it was the first sporting event actually I ever attended. And yeah, KG and Marbury, man, I had a Marbury jersey growing up. I think it was a hand-me-down from my brother technically, but you're right that they were the most polarizing athletes in town at the time. And they were, for the late 90s kids, they're athletes.
I mean, this was the 1997 Twins were a disaster. The North Stars were gone.
Yeah.
And the Vikings were just sort
and
of...
Moss was not here yet. Yeah,
you know,
that's exactly right.
This was it, man. This was it.
This was fun.
And that's a wrap on another episode.
That was a fun game to watch,
Minnesota Sports Rewind. You can binge all of our episodes anywhere you find podcasts. Apple, Spotify, the SKOR North app, which is free to download. Much more on the breaking Kevin Garnett comments about Glen Taylor in The Athletic on SKOR North Live today and on Mackey and Judd with Rami a little bit later. Thanks for listening.